All right, welcome to Writing Workshop. This is the fourth lesson that we are going to be doing today, and it's a revision lesson. You should definitely think about doing this revision if you're finished with your flash draft and you already had a chance to do a little revising before, maybe based on the geography. So today's writing lesson is going to be focused on drawing on an awareness of timelines to make revisions to your work. And I'm going to show you what I mean by that. We are going to spend some time rereading a draft, and then you're going to look for a place where it would be helpful to clarify where and when an event took place, or when a series of events happened. When you find that place, then you're going to have to find an appropriate timeline to help you to understand when each event or when that particular event happened. And then finally, you're going to incorporate what you learned from the timeline by using maybe a part of the timeline in the revision of your writing. So let me show you how I'm going to do this with my own writing. So the first step, I'm going to reread my draft and find a place where it would be helpful to clarify when an event took place or when a series of events happened. So one place that really stood out to me in my writing when I went to go reread was this piece of my writing on the Trail of Tears, the Indian Removal Act. A law called the Indian Removal Act was supposed to pay the 5 tribes for their land, and in exchange they were supposed to move west of the Mississippi River. The reality was very different from the law. The Native Americans were forced off their lands, and they had no choice after they were pushed to sign unfair treaties. Not every nation went at the same time. Beginning in 1831 with the Choctaw, the tribes were forced to move west or were forcibly removed by the U.S. Army. So a couple places I could maybe go with this. Clearly, I could talk about how maybe this unfair treaties, I know I did some reading, and I have a timeline that shows that unfair treaties, and I also know that this, like the process of removal might be interesting to talk about. So I got to do this next step, which is I got to find an appropriate timeline to help me understand when each event happened. So I have a couple things here. This timeline right here talks about the events leading up to the Cherokee removal on the Trail of Tears. So when I wrote about the unfair treaties, I know I read specifically about the Cherokee unfair treaty, that new Echota Treaty. So this timeline kind of talks about the New Echota Treaty and how that was unfair. So I could definitely use this timeline to help me. But if I'm actually thinking that this whole thing is about the Trail of Tears, and the Trail of Tears wasn't just focused on the Cherokee, it was like multiple tribes, I might want to go with this one over here, because this one lays out each of the tribes here, and then the dates of the removal, sort of like when the removal began and when it ended. And then it talks about the numbers of the tribes before they were removed, and then this is the total number that was removed. And then here are the deaths as the result of the removal. And of course, this is like to the best of these historians' knowledge, but this is how the timeline kind of works. It's sort of like if there was an arrow kind of going down this way, you know, it goes from 1831 all the way to like 1842. It sort of talks about all of these different like data points on that timeline. I think I want to use this one when I go to revise. So here we go. This is kind of like one way you can revise. So the first thing I did is I kept the text the same. I didn't really make any changes to it, but I used that timeline to kind of create a visual timeline that I think is a little easier to understand. So basically, I have the 5 tribes that were removed here: Choctaw, Seminole, Creek, Chickasaw, and Cherokee. And I just put them in order of when they started to be removed. So the Choctaw started to be removed in 1831, according to this, this timeline here. Then the next was the Seminole. They were the next tribes to start being removed. And then over here is the Creek. See, it's the Seminole, 1832. The Creek is 1834. The Chickasaw is in 1837, right? They started to be removed. And then the Cherokee in 1838 started to be removed there. The Seminole are interesting because if you remember from our read aloud, they sort of fought this long, like 10-year war. So they're mentioned last because they were like the last ones to go, but actually they began to be removed like second in this list of like the tribes and their removal. So I listed them second here just so people can sort of see, my reader can sort of see like when these tribes were first sort of started to be removed. And so I made sure to include the names of the tribes, you know, how long it took them to be removed, and then the number of people who died. I thought that was really powerful, and I wanted to include that number as well. Another thing that I wanted to include was the fact that the Cherokee also had some slaves in their number. And I know that one of the articles that we read about the slavery in with some of these Native American tribes, so I kind of wanted to mention that because that seemed important. So this is one option. You can definitely do like a visual timeline like I have done that. And if you're interested in doing this in your Google Docs, I can definitely maybe I'll do another video to show you sort of how you can do that using shapes and text boxes to sort of do that work. Those of you who are kind of good with the computer, you can maybe figure out how to do that. You know, using like a timeline like this, which has a ton of information, I sort of just took only the information that I really thought would help, you know, kind of tell my story that I wanted to tell. And there's a lot of other information I just kind of left there on that. Now, the other thing that you can do is to use that information and make some revisions in your writing. So here I change the text a little bit. Everything's kind of the same until we get to this point where I'm talking about after the unfair treaties, where I'm talking about removal. So I say here, not every nation went at the same time. In 1831, the Choctaw tribe was forced to move west. The Seminole began a war with the U.S. Army in 1832 that lasted for 10 years until their defeat. Each year in between saw thousands of First Nations leave the eastern U.S. In 1834, the Creek began their move of nearly 20,000 people. The Chickasaw began their removal in 1837 with over 4,000. The Cherokee removal began in 1838 and took 3 years to move 20,000 people along with their 2,000 slaves. So you kind of see here where I've taken that information that I found, again, back here, and I've sort of used it to make a revision of my writing and incorporated it in that way. So both of these things that I've done here, I'm modeling for you, are things you can do with your own writing. So what I'm going to encourage you to do is to go through those same steps. And just to go back to the beginning, here's our steps for that. One, you've got to reread your draft. You have to find a place, or maybe there's more than one place, where it would be helpful to clarify when this event took place, you know, in terms of like in relationship to other events. Or maybe, in the case of me, when there's like a series of events that happen, like when the different tribes were forced to be removed. Once you have that done, you got to find an appropriate timeline. I am posting up in this assignment several timelines that I think will be really useful. I have one for Lewis and Clark. I have one for like the Mexican-American War. I have a really long, big one that you kind of have to dig through that sort of goes through the whole of Western expansion that you might find useful if you're doing outlaws topic, or maybe gold rush, or Bass Reeves, African American. That one would be really, really helpful to you. So you got to kind of skim through and look and see which one would be really helpful, and it's going to help you to figure out, you know, how to make your revision using that timeline. And then you got to incorporate what you learned from the timeline, and you got to use part of the timeline in the revision of your writing. Again, two options that I sort of gave you there, where you could like actually create a timeline that sort of uses some data that you found, and it doesn't necessarily have to come from a timeline. Maybe you have an article that has a lot of data, a lot of dates and things that you want to turn into a timeline. You could do it that way. Or you could do it in another way where you could just sort of incorporate some information from the timeline into your writing. Both ways are great. I can't wait to see what you do in terms of your revisions. Have a great day.